Sure. So I'm going to echo some of what Kim said. I really think that one of the issues, I mean, we asked the question, are we at the point where we really respect them? And the bottom line is, if you look at the community as a whole, we're not even at the point as a country where we've afforded them what the LGBTQ community of what I believe to be a basic civil right, which is protection against discrimination. So I think that's kind of the starting point. The other thing I'd mention is related to Jesse's point, which was there's many different ways to define diversity, and I view it as an iceberg, and some people may have seen this image, but at the top, or the tip of the iceberg, are our visible characteristics. Female, what your gender is, what your race is, potentially ethnicity, and underneath the water are all these invisible aspects of diversity: socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, background, education, viewpoint. There's a lot under the water that we don't see. And as a community, I really believe that we need to start to embrace these other invisible aspects of diversity, because those are what will create the most dynamic workplaces in general, and that includes sexual orientation.
Thank you. Reverend Speed.
I would say no, and I remember very vividly, not too long ago, when the amendment to the Human Rights Act was being proposed, and I remember very clearly the kind of intolerant and the kind of discriminatory and inflammatory responses that were given in reaction to persons of a different lifestyle. I say different and not alternative. And when the amendment to the act passed, which added protective clauses to particular communities that were implicitly included but not explicitly included in the act, the reaction by the majority of people in our community was still very negative and stigmatizing and demonizing of persons who choose to have particular kinds of lifestyles. And so I would say that there's a start. I think the amendment to the Human Rights Act provides somewhat of a baseline, but we definitely have a long way to go. I mean, for sure, if we're living in a community where people are not tolerant of racial differences, of gender differences, then all of the other differences that you might think enhance and strengthen a community in terms of having a community embrace diversity, those also become deficits in a dominant culture that thrives on dividing and ruling. And so I think that there's room for all of us to develop a level of maturity in terms of how we view and how we tolerate differences in our community.
Okay, now this is the last one that I'm going to pose it out to the group, and then we're going to go to some very specific questions, and if it kind of hits you, we want you to speak on it, so this is the last one. In Bermuda, there's a belief that you should wait your turn. If you're under the age of 45, and I say 45 because I'm creeping closer to that age now, you have very little to offer. Do we have an exclusive disrespect in Bermuda for youth or young leadership? Is it a figment of young leaders, emerging leaders' imagination, or do we respect individuals who are young but still classified as leaders?
Well, next to Mrs. Hunter R. Scott, I'm the youngest person on this panel, I think. I would say in general, yes and no. From my personal experience, I have been afforded many opportunities to sit on various boards, locally, internationally, statutory boards, and also the BHS board. So I think I've been able to surround myself in spaces where the value of being young is valued and is brought to the table. I think there are certain arenas where a little bit more experience is needed, and I'm gonna put that arena being in politics. I know in some jurisdictions you have to be at least 35 before you run in politics. And whilst we do celebrate young people, I think there is something that can be said about having more experience to bring to the table when dealing with certain leadership opportunities and leadership issues.
Okay, if I can be the devil's advocate,
Sure.
if you look across Bermuda, we're talking about in church leadership, community club leadership, in business leadership, there is very little representation of people. Actually, if you consider under 30 even,
Right.
most of the times you're looking at people that are post 40, above 40.
Right.
In your sphere, you have been afforded some critical opportunities, but is that a representation in the typical environment in Bermuda as it relates to youth voice and youth leadership?
No, it's not typical, but I think that may largely be in part due to my peers not knowing what opportunities exist. I know within your fraternity, one of your brothers is the president of PHC, which is a huge feat and a great representation of a young person assuming the mantle of leadership. But I think young people need to realize that there are opportunities, but you have to make, again, going back to my initial statement, you have to make your intention and desires known to lead. There are leaders who will be willing to invest in you and, if not give you that mantle of leadership, allow you to come alongside them, to shadow them, to be mentored by them, so that you can, in turn, assume those roles of leadership. And it also goes back to not being fearful of failing. And also, there are times I'm sitting in board meetings where I feel like I'm punching out of my weight class, but that's how I'm going to become a better leader, by learning from those who I'm sitting at the board table with.
Really quickly, I want to jump to Jason, and the reason why I want to jump to Jason because if we're being totally transparent, Jason is a relatively young man considering where he sits. He he's in charge of a body of men and women that are 4,500 strong, and it's arguably one of the largest collective voices in our country. Am I accurate in saying you're the youngest president in the history of the organization? Am I correct?
Second youngest.
Second young. Who's the first, may I ask?
John Penn was the youngest. I believe he was 29 in 1981.
Wow. So that's actually very profound. Yeah. How is it in your world where you are a leader who is under the age of 40? What are your experiences in that regard?
In terms of direct experiences, it's very difficult. When you enter into an organization that persons have been in that organization for many years, or persons have watched you grow, literally watch you grow and develop, it is very difficult to come in and commend leadership. How you do get leadership if you build confidence, and you build confidence through a set of what I will consider to be defining moments. Moments that test you, moments where you're allowed to prove your leadership ability. And as you succeed through those defining moments, you begin to build confidence one step at a time. At a certain point in time, you demand enough confidence to effectively lead, and persons then feel motivated, and you have the ability to influence persons. But coming in the door in an organization such as a union, it is very, very extremely difficult. What I've now seen is, I set myself, whereas for the more senior members, we're not butting heads. I have a role to play, and they have a role to play. I respect and acknowledge their wisdom and experience, and I try to lean on their wisdom and experience. When they give me advice, for the most part, I try to follow it. Because if you don't do so, and you continuously get into an organization and you're butting heads as a young leader, people begin to dismiss you. And you don't want to be dismissed because you may have a lot to offer. As a result, what we do is we come into organizations and we try to show the value or the worth that we have as young leaders. And that's for several organizations I'm a part of. Most organizations I'm in a part of, I've been the youngest in the room. And first, I had to get permission to speak. Now, when a topic's on the floor, persons wait, look over at me, and they want to hear what comes out of my mouth. Because through a series of meetings, I've contributed and I've shared my value.
Very well said.
So I could speak from an international business standpoint, if I may. I think it's a little bit different in that experience tends to be a combination of things. It's not just time, it's exposure, and it's successfully completing tasks, right? So depending on whatever discipline you're in, so I would argue for Sister Cairns over here that law is a much longer discipline. I would argue that. I mean, you have to really pore over the case study. Law is detailed, is intricate. I'm an underwriter. I will get better with time, but I possess the skills technically, and I'm still growing in those areas as well, very much so. But I can complete my task. With time, I'll get better at it, and I'll become wiser at it. But with the time that I have in the industry so far, which is just over 12 years, right? Underwriting for just over a year. The exposure that I've had in Bermuda and around the world, and the tasks that I've been given and have accomplished all lead to what I call experience. It's not just a time-based factor. And so it depends on what industry and what discipline you're in, how we chalk up experience differently. It's not so much the case in my industry that you have to wait your turn. When you're ready, you're ready. And if there's an opportunity, then off you go.
I'm going to move right on. Going to a different topic now, spirituality. Has the community of faith in Bermuda diversified its leadership model to take into consideration the critical issues facing Bermuda in 2015? Has the households of faith, that's Christian, Muslim, all our communities, do we feel they've done enough to diversify their leadership model to be effective in Bermuda in 2015?
Point of clarity. When we say diversify the leadership model, what exactly do you mean?
Very good question. It means they've done things pretty much the same way for a very long time. We've seen what most church leaderships look like. Have they diversified? And I'll leave diversification to what you view it to be in your mind. But have we seen a dynamic shift in how those organizations appeal to other individuals in their community to actually bring them into their proverbial folds? Why is everybody looking at Reverend Tweed?
I know.
And Reverend Tweed not looking at the mic.
Looking back at me.
This is the one time you should jump to the mic, right?
All right, I guess I'll take a crack at it first. So leadership in churches is governed by Scripture, or at least it ought to be. Yeah, when you're speaking of the Christian church anyway. God defines leadership. He doesn't leave that up to us, right? Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, He defines what leadership is. And within those parameters, there is only so much room to move left and so much room to move right and still be in keeping with those parameters. So you can diversify as much as you like from a scriptural standpoint, but it has to be within those parameters. Now, I think what you'll see today is that, there are lots of different, congregations and houses of faith and all the rest of it, and I'm sure the leadership looks vastly different from one extreme to the next. But just biblically speaking, there's a very defined parameter for leadership.
Let me be a little more specific.